between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and the U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, over the past several days, representatives from the United States, Japan, South Korea, and North Korea have been talking in Sweden, San Francisco, and Finland, laying the groundwork for the proposed summit. The word proposed is important, since this is uncharted territory for both the United States and North Korea, which has still not publicly confirmed the summit invitation. And while Americans are generally split on their opinions about the summit, South Koreans are increasingly optimistic about prospects for peace. We have more from VOA Seoul Bureau Chief Brian Padden.
Overall, people on the streets of Seoul are hopeful about expected North Korea nuclear talks.
No one likes war, not North Korea here or surrounding countries as well. So I think it will go toward peace.
More than 70% of respondents to a recent South Korean public opinion poll were in favor of the expected summits between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in in April, and then in May between Kim and U.S. President Donald Trump. North Korea this year opened the door to nuclear disarmament talks by suspending further intercontinental ballistic missile tests to potentially target the U.S. mainland, and by participating in the Pyeongchang Olympics in the South. The North Korean leader then told a South Korean envoy that he is willing to engage in denuclearization talks. More than 60% of South Korean respondents in the poll were skeptical North Korea would abide by the terms of a denuclearization deal.
I think we cannot trust 100% of what North Koreans say on denuclearization, as they are so good at lying.
And we're prepared for anything, right?
Trump, for the first time, gained a higher favorability rating than Chinese President Xi Jinping in a South Korean survey after he agreed to meet with Kim without preconditions, while emphasizing sanctions would remain in place until a nuclear deal is reached. In another poll, Moon's approval rating increased to more than 70% in response to his proactive diplomatic efforts to facilitate denuclearization talks.
I do not know what the outcome will be, but I think that the attempt itself is meaningful.
뜻깊다고 생각하고 문재인 정부 들어서 이제 사람들이 기대하는 통일에 대해서 상상하기 시작한 것 같아요.
Planning for the nuclear summits are underway, even though North Korea has not yet confirmed its participation. The degree to which North Korea will actually go to dismantle its nuclear program in order to end harsh U.S.-led sanctions remains a key issue to be resolved. Brian Padden, VOA News, Seoul.
How important is it that North Korea has not acknowledged the summit nor confirmed its participation? VOA's Korean service has been watching and listening to what's being said on both sides of the demilitarized zone. Dong-hyuk Lee is chief of VOA's Korean service. Dong has been with VOA since 2006. Also joining us, VOA Korean reporter Connie Kim, who interviewed North Korean defector Ji Seong-ho for us last month. Let me go first to you, Dong. North Korea, at least as far as we know, has not acknowledged the summit, but we're all talking about it here in the U.S. What do you make of the fact that it has not been acknowledged in North Korea?
Yes, Greta, you're right. North Korea has not made any official statement on the proposed summit. I read an interesting dispatch, issued from Pyongyang on Tuesday through KCNA, their official state media. Its English version now saying that there's a sign of a change. I'm very careful about the wording here. Sign of a change in relations with the U.S. is appearing. So I think they're sort of trying to slowly moving toward that big announcement. But I think Kim Jong-un is waiting for the perfect moment so that he can have his own way to announce the news.
All right, it's a heavily controlled media, obviously, in DPRK, North Korea. Are you able to read what's written in Korean? And is that the same sentiment as to what's being released in English?
Excellent question. It is often the case that there is a sort of a difference in nuance and sometimes, different even vocabularies if you compare those two versions. But I don't think there's much difference in this particular case because this is such a matter that the dear leader himself is heavily involved in, and he claims to be the mastermind of the whole thing. So I have to double check, but I'll be very surprised to see any major difference between Korean version of KCNA and the English version of it.
Connie, you cover this for us here at VOA, everything Korean, but you also grew up there. And I imagine many of your friends, their grandparents may have come from North Korea or may have relatives there. But this is several generations since the armistice was signed in 1953. Is your generation still paying, wall-to-wall attention to North Korea?
Well, I think most of the South Korean people right now are definitely immune to the North Korean threat because we've been living under the North Korean nuclear threat for about 60 years now. And we've been under the threat of North Korea because their artillery can reach the South Korean soil. And I think it's business as usual for South Koreans. But the reason why the North Korean nuclear threat has become such an imminent issue right now is because of North Korea's voice that they're capable of hitting the U.S. mainland now.
All right. Let me ask you about a Twitter comment. We have viewers who tweet us all the time. Yasser Afghan says, "What could be a potential rationale for the world's most isolated country to change its stance overnight, to come to a negotiation table with its sworn enemy?" That, of course, would be the United States. What in the world happened that, with all the saber rattling and all the insults going back and forth between the President of the United States and Kim Jong-un, what's changed that now he seems to want to talk?
That's another excellent question. Remember, when Kim Jong-un delivered his New Year's speech on the nuclear issue, there has not been much change. Actually, if you look at the wording carefully, I think he said that they're going to move on to the mass production of nuclear weapons, separate from signs of a thaw with South Korea. Try to have some type of reconciliations with South Korea. He was very clear about his position on the nuclear issue. Now it's been only 3 months or so. And in May, President Trump is supposed to meet with Kim Jong-un. So I think there is a lot to be sorted out and a lot that President Trump needs to find out when he meets with Kim Jong-un.
Connie, have the sanctions imposed by the United Nations, have they had an impact inside North Korea? Could that have some contributing factor to the fact that at least this is the first time we see Kim Jong-un reaching out to the United States?
I think sanctions are definitely taking a hit on North Korea, and I think that's what made Kim Jong-un come up and say that he wants to have talks with President Donald Trump. Well, they've been hit with the most strongest sanctions from the United Nations. And as Dong said, if we look at the Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech, he's extending an olive branch to South Korea, but at the same time, he's threatening the U.S. that he has a nuclear button on his desk, which is he's probably wanting to make that rift between the two allies and get an ease of sanctions.
Well, it's by divide and conquer too.
Yes.
Cozy up to South Korea and perhaps in his thinking draw a wedge. Now it was reported today recently that South Korea wants to be part of the summit.
Exactly.
Do you expect that?
Well, President Moon's comments came from an Inter-Korean Summit Preparatory Committee, and he said, he said if the U.S.-North Korea summit happens in Panmunjom at the Truce Village in the demilitarized zone, it could be possible for South Korea to join the trilateral summit. But again, it depends on how South Korea and North Korea.
Let me just make one quick point to what Connie just said. Yes, Trump made a lot of efforts to put the maximum pressure on North Korea, and it's a big part of North Korea's possible change of attitude. Now, we sort of ignore the fact that while Trump is putting a lot of pressure on North Korea, at the same time, he always left the room for dialogue. What's the evidence? Well, if you compare it to the previous administration, Obama administration has been maintaining that, we are asking the North Korean regime to denuclearize, but we have no intention of, seeking a regime change in North Korea. That's all they could say. Now, this administration, that's what is called as a four no's. There are major principles in dealing with North Korea, and they are not seeking a regime change in North Korea. Furthermore, they are not seeking a collapse of the regime. They are not seeking accelerated reunification of the peninsula. They are not seeking any excuse to send the U.S. military north of the 38th parallel. I mean, to me, it's really, really accommodating to the North Korean point of view. So we always have to remember, putting pressure on North Korea is one thing, but at the same time, Trump administration putting a lot of efforts for dialogue too.
Connie, all the attention seems to be on nuclear weapons, but as you noted that they have all those artillery weapons that can reach Seoul that they've got on the southern border of North Korea, but they've also got some sort of chemical biological weapon program. We know that after what happened to Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of Kim Jong-un. Is there any focus on the possibility of biological, chemical, and discussion about artillery in this summit on nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't know what specific agendas are going to be on the agenda for the Inter-Korean Summit, but we know that denuclearization of the North Korean regime is definitely on the table. But in terms of use of its biological weapons, that's also been a very concerning sentiment among the South Korean public. But I think we haven't reached too far enough to talk about that issue yet, but I'm pretty sure that they will discuss a broad range of issues when it comes to
There's a lot to talk about among these three countries. Anyway, thank you both very much. And there are more than 23,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, and the U.S. and South Korea have agreed to resume joint military exercises on April 1. That display of military strength is taking place against this backdrop of a historic diplomatic talk. Earlier, I spoke to VOA's White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman, who not only knows what's going on at the White House, but is also one of the most plugged-in reporters on Asian issues. Okay, Steve, what is the latest on this anticipated summit between the United States and North Korea, and maybe even including South Korea?
Well, what there has been in Finland, of all places, an unofficial meeting involving a couple of former U.S. ambassadors to South Korea, and they met not only with the South Koreans there, but with the North Koreans as well. And these are sort of unofficial talks, perhaps, about having official talks to then set up the summit. So we're a long way, Greta, from getting to the summit. We yet don't even know where or when.
All right, well, that was sort of the interesting part, is that President Trump had said that it was going to happen before May 1st. Is that just an impossibility at this point?
Well, in this White House, nothing is impossible. They pull out all kinds of surprises, and usually if the president says jump, people will have to say here how high. So not impossible, but it is really looking unlikely, considering we're getting into late March and there's just no agreement, as far as we can tell, about where to hold the summit, and that is as big a question as anything else.
Well, there was some discussion of perhaps holding it in Sweden. I know that in North Korea, that Sweden has been the connection from the United States to the North Korean government. Is Sweden not in the picture? You mentioned that they were meeting in Finland.
Right. Well, I think Sweden's in the picture as much as any other place you can name. There are also some possibilities a little bit closer to home for Kim Jong-un, such as China, but he hasn't even visited Xi Jinping yet. So for him to make the first trip to China to meet the President of the United States would be remarkable. Perhaps the so-called truce village at Panmunjom is another possibility. That way, technically, he doesn't even leave North Korea. But will the President of the United States be willing to go there? And of course, I think Donald Trump would perhaps be open to hosting the North Korean leader here in Washington, D.C.
Are there any restrictions to Kim Jong-un traveling? Because you have the UN sanctions on many of the people in North Korea. So can he travel to the United States? Could he travel to China?
Yes, we saw a recent case where some Russian officials who were on a sanctions list were allowed to come to the United States. So in the name of diplomacy, the U.S. and South Korea and North Korea could all go to the UN and also get China's consent to sort of look over some of the things. I think it's more of a logistical challenge at this point, because how would the North Korean leader say if he was to go to Sweden or come here to the United States? The North Koreans don't appear to have an aircraft that perhaps could fly that far. The North Korean leaders in the past, his father and grandfather, always preferred to travel by train, as you know, instead of plane. So I think they'd be much more comfortable putting him on a train somewhere.
All right. When the president first spoke about it, when news first broke here in the United States, it seemed like it was a green light, all systems go. Now I'm reading in the paper and hearing from other other people that there may be some sort of preconditions, which naturally begins to create an impediment to happening. Are there preconditions that the United States is putting on the table to this meeting?
We've been getting mixed messages on that. Sarah Huckabee Sanders at one point had talked about a number of preconditions and also said that the North would have to demonstrate its willingness to denuclearize before any talks. Then that was papered over, so to speak. And I think as far as Donald Trump is concerned and what he has said is that there are really no preconditions.
You know, it's sort of interesting. I know that you've spent so much time covering this peninsula. If the two do meet and there is a picture taken of Kim Jong-un and President Trump, where they're standing next to each other, shaking their hand, that's gonna ricochet around the world to be used by North Korea, is it not?
Certainly, it would be a major propaganda victory, something highly symbolic for the North. But there are those who advocate discussions with North Korea who would say that is an acceptable price to pay if it means avoiding war.
And in fact, we are now at the point where they have an ICBM delivery system and a nuclear weapon. I don't know if they've miniaturized it so they can actually deliver it, but we are at a different time, and just having them at the table talking may be something that may be our only hope besides war.
Well, that is definitely a point that a lot of people are making. Much better to be talking than fighting. But another argument is if you have these two leaders who meet and it does not work out, then you've exhausted that very high-level diplomacy that you would want to use in normal circumstances as the very last case to sign some sort of agreement. So this is a very high risk. And also, you've been to North Korea, I've been to North Korea, and one thing that I learned when I was there, speaking with North Koreans and extensively and in subsequent years speaking with diplomats that have been posted there, is we think of North Korea as monolithic. Yes, Kim Jong-un is the supreme leader, but there are factions in North Korea, and in the past, when we could say the more liberal factions, such as from the foreign ministry, have tried to engage in outreach, they've been sabotaged internally by hardliners. So could there be some sort of provocation that the North says the South started something and we have some sort of military clash at a small scale that the hardliners in Pyongyang can use as an excuse not to hold this summit? That's always a possibility. So to say that there's definitely going to be a summit and it's going to happen by May, I think is highly a risky bet to take at this point, Greta.
Steve, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Is the White House on the right track? What outcomes are the parties hoping for? I'll ask two experts. John Lenczowski, he's president of the Institute of World Politics. He advised President Ronald Reagan during those historic talks with Soviet Union's Mikhail Gorbachev. Gil Rozman is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's also editor of the ASEAN Forum and International Relations Journal. Gentlemen, welcome both of you. And let me go first to you, Gil. I know what we want. We want the nuclear weapons gone, and also probably chemical and biological program, as well as I assume the artillery facing South Korea. What does Kim Jong-un want?
He wants recognition of North Korea as a kind of an equal state, and to have that, he has to keep his nuclear weapons, or to have some amazing relationship where the whole region recognizes North Korea as a strong power which will be heavily rewarded. So he wants to shape the future of the Korean Peninsula and get the right balance of power in Northeast Asia to preserve his regime and give him clout.
All right, John, we just heard what Gil says that he wants, and as noted by our report, I've been to North Korea, and it is hermetically sealed off for the world, so we're dealing with something that is very unusual. If Kim Jong-un wants to keep his nuclear weapons, and that's sort of a deal breaker for us, where are we?
Well, I think that we have to focus on two fundamental principles. One is, what is the source of tensions between the two sides? And the source is not really the nuclear weapons. The source is the nature of that regime. The second is, what are the conditions for peace. And we have to remember what the great Soviet human rights activist and the inventor of the Soviet H-bomb, Andrei Sakharov, said. He said that the Kremlin will never have peace with the West until it has peace with its own people. And it will never have peace with its own people until it respects their human rights.
All right, well, we have a Facebook question from Dwayne Griffith, which reads, history has shown little success in negotiating with madmen, even by great statesmen and brilliant negotiators. Hitler certainly comes to mind along with Stalin. It doesn't sound, Gil, like Dwayne is convinced that we really are going to negotiate anything. And if nuclear weapons, they want their nuclear weapons and we say no, it does rather look grim, although I'm hoping for a diplomatic solution.
This is a long process. People who are getting their hopes up that this meeting is going to provide a real answer, I think are too optimistic. What we really can expect is we begin a process of negotiations where North Korea promises something and pledges to go forward, and then all of the other countries, China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, enter into the fray trying to shape this process, and North Korea tries to play on the differences, what each country wants to get an advantage. It may sound like we're getting denuclearization, but that's so far off that other things will take precedence.
And they've got the problem, John, and not to be a naysayer on this, is that we know that North Korea has cheated before in their promises. We've got the great framework that fell apart because of cheating that gone on behind the scenes. Plus, we are at a very different situation right now. We are not than we were like even a year ago. They've got an ICBM, which is a delivery system, and they've got a nuclear weapon. They seem, most experts think they're very close to marrying these two, the weapon with the delivery system. What would be your advice on strategy going into this?
Well, I think that we have to have a policy of credible deterrence. I think we need considerably to beef up our missile defenses. I think that we need to harden our national electric grid because, for all I know, Kim may have the he may already have the capability to detonate a nuclear weapon without particularly great accuracy, but 50 to 100 miles above the surface of the United States and take out our entire electric grid. So we have to do these normal defensive measures. I also think we have to be very skeptical about the potential results for diplomacy. I think that the summit diplomacy and negotiations are ultimately a form of North Korean political warfare against the United States. They can play on our public opinion, and we can't play on theirs. And so what we have to do is try to we have to try to bring about political change within their system.
One of the hardest things I think we have is this Korean pride. I mean, we've got the situation. They've got the Pueblo, the 1968 U.S. naval vessel that they seized in 1968. They still have this naval vessel. In fact, there is a picture of it. It's in Pyongyang, in its harbor, and is a trophy about how they took down the great Americans. And they've got the whole time that I was there, is that what struck me is that 24/7 they're training against us. They think, well, I'm ordering, pizza and looking for a movie on Saturday night. They think I'm training to kill them, and they've got this pride that they don't want us to overrun them. So, Gil, where does this lead us in negotiations?
Well, they're one source of pride, and it's a very big obstacle. But we also have South Korean pride. They want to manage the process. They felt so marginalized as things were getting tense last year, that the Moon Jae-in, who came to power saying, I'm going to take charge of the reunification and the discussions with North Korea, felt he was getting nothing accomplished. And then there's Chinese pride, particularly in trying to create a Sino-centric region where the Korean Peninsula is back to where it was more than a century ago and being under Chinese leadership and deference. So it's going to be difficult to manage all of those sources of pride, and we know that one of the sources of North Korean pride is standing up to China, and that gives us a little bit of hope that there can be some maneuvering where North Korea really does want to create a balance that will be favorable to some outcome other than a nuclear North Korea against everybody else.
John, we have less than 2 minutes. Why now, and why is Kim Jong-un he made the first gesture to meet. At least we think he did. He made the first gesture. And we've got the situation where these dueling tweets where the President of the United States calls him Rocket Man. He says he has been they're bragging about the nuclear buttons. I mean, why have we gotten to the point now that there might be a sit-down?
Well, I think that Kim is very interested in psychologically disarming his adversaries, both in South Korea and in the United States. And summit diplomacy is a way of doing that. And I think that we need to start thinking not simply about relations with the North Korean government, we have to think about relations with the North Korean people. This is public diplomacy. And that means connecting with them. It means letting them know that we care about their human rights, that we are not the monsters that the regime makes us out to be.
But the place is hermetically sealed. They have, I mean, I was shocked at what they thought of what they knew about us, which is very little. I mean, the idea that, first of all, that I'm sitting there training on a Saturday night is absurd, you know, to try to kill them. They've been doing it since 1953 when the armistice was signed.
We need to be broadcasting more. We need to be sending in receivers of different kinds, different communications methods. This is what the defectors from North Korea say we have to do.
And I'm going to take the last one up, but it's a grim situation since the time clock has now brought us to the point where, you know, they have this delivery system and they have this weapon. They've not been able to marry the two, as far as we know, but, you know, the time is, you know, unfortunately not on our side. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you both. We have to end the conversation here. John Lenczowski is president of the Institute of World Politics, and Gil Rozman, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you both for joining us. Before we go, a couple of updates on last week's topic, tariffs and trade. The United States is now challenging India, but at the World Trade Organization, challenging them over export subsidies, saying it gives India an unfair advantage over the United States. The president, though, is not using an executive order to take action this time. Separately, the U.S. will reportedly impose $60 billion in tariffs on other products besides steel and aluminum made in China and imported by the United States. The products targeted are those the Trump administration claims were developed using stolen trade secrets. An announcement about that is expected by Friday. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me at Twitter @Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.